I get questions from time to time about what do brush sizes mean. And the short answer is not much. Here you can see these are all round brushes. They're all size 2. This is from an American brush manufacturer named Dynasty. This is the Raphael 8404. Here's a Da Vinci Series 35. Here's an Artist Opus Series S, and here's a Winsor & Newton Series 7. These are all Kolinsky Sable brushes, all very good, all very nice, top quality brushes. I've seen all of these except the Dynasty being used by some miniature painters and other, painters of note in our hobby. So they're all top-end brushes. But if you look, the size varies. The Winsor & Newton and the Raphael are both fairly large and have fairly fat bellies, whereas the Da Vinci and the Artist Opus are a little smaller, especially the Artist Opus, a little smaller, and their bellies aren't as big. The Dynasty brush is about as long as the bigger ones, but its belly is much thinner. So when someone says, that they use a Series 2 or a size 2, for example, know that that's going to be relative. Now, if you get the Artist Opus and not the Raphael, you're not missing out on anything. They're both going to work. You're really only using, the lower third of the brush anyway. And this is one of those areas that, in the other videos I've done about brush painting and growing in brush painting, you've really got to get to where you're painting a lot of minis or a lot of things that require brush painting to start seeing the difference between the belly on this one and the belly on this one and what distinction that's going to make for your painting. And even then, there's plenty of people who prefer a smaller profile than a bigger profile. So what I'd recommend when it comes to brush sizes when thinking about, a size 2 or a size 4, or whatever, don't get hung up on the relative difference. Just know that they are relative sizes. And generally, for most detail painting on anything, a size 2 is going to be kind of the go-to, because you're really worried about the point. You're not as worried about the length of the bristle and things like that. So, but just know that when you're seeing brushes, that the size is not a standardized thing. Even the size of the handle. All of these have roughly the same handle size except for the Dynasty, which I know you can't see the full handle, but the Dynasty, say compared with this one, is a much longer handle. And when I order, I always specify the short handle, because if you get the long handle, they're much longer. So even the handles can be different, but the sizes are roughly the same in terms of they're going to be close to each other, as you can see here, but they're going to be a little different. So don't worry if the size 2 you get doesn't match the size 2 that I use or somebody else uses. Now, another thing when it comes to sizing brushes is within the same range, and even, in any range, there's going to be different sizes, like a size 2, a size 3, a size 4, a size 0, a size 1. Now, there are also different numerical sizes in terms of a size 2, a size 3, a size 4, whatever. Here are 2 from Rosemary & Co. This is a 2, this is a 4, and you see the size difference there. A 3 would be somewhere about between these. And if you look, some of them carry them all the way up to, like, I think size 20s. I mean, you can, when you get into real fine art kind of brushes, there can be some really big, expensive brushes. For the most part in our hobby, we're going to use, I've seen some guys use up to a size 8 when they're trying to paint minis and they're just wanting to load a lot of paint in the brush and just get some base layers down. I tend to stick with things no bigger than maybe a 4. I have some that are older and more beat up that I use for all sorts of things. This is an old cheap synthetic. This is about a size 4. Now, a question came to me, and actually is the base question that prompted this video, about, well, what does this mean when I see either a series of zeros, 0, 0, 0, or I see a number and then a slash and a 0. And what that's basically conveying is something smaller than 0. That's what it's talking about. And again, it's just a relative number. But like this is from Da Vinci. This is a synthetic brush, but it's a 3-0. And you can see the difference in size between these, even though they're different ranges. So it's just a smaller round brush. It's just scaled down. The belly's going to be smaller. The length of the bristles is going to be smaller. There's still going to be a real great tip on it, but it's just overall a smaller brush. I have seen as fine as 10-0, and it's basically like a bristle, but that's what those numbers mean. So whether you see it as 3 zeros or 2 zeros, or something like that, or 3/0, 2/0, it's conveying the same thing. They're all just smaller. It's just going from larger to smaller, and that's conveying the relative size, which has more meaning within a range in terms of strict sizing, but even between ranges. You know that if you get a 4 from one manufacturer and a 2 from another manufacturer and a 3/0 from another one, you know that they're still going to be relatively larger or smaller than each other. Now, there are different classes of brush also. Typically, what we're using in our hobby for just general painting and things like that are what's called round. Now, there may be some manufacturers that make distinctions between long rounds and short rounds. And no, I don't mean the kid in that second Indiana Jones movie that was awful. But round in the sense that they're fairly long, they're fairly round at the base. I mean, you see, that's it's what we just generally call a brush. Then there's another classification is liner brush, which tend to be very long and thin, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in just a second. Now, there are another class that generally fall under the name of flat. Now, what I've found in researching this, I found some sources, fine art sources, that say, oh, there's 7 types of brushes, and they list those 7 types. Another one said there's 8 types of brushes. When I go to Blick's website for looking at brushes, they classify them 15 different ways. And yet, when you start looking at some of them, you start saying, well, what's the difference between a shader and a bright and a flat and a chisel and a blender? Well, sometimes, and I'm sure that somebody at an art store or a fine artist could tell me, well, the difference between those is this. Basically, they're all the same. They just have to do with size. Like I noticed that the ones that were called blenders tended to be a little bigger than the ones that were shaders. And the shaders tended to be smaller than the ones that were bright. And the flats tended to cover a whole bunch of things and all of that. Really, when you're talking flat, shader, chisel, any of that, you're talking one of these brushes that's wide and flat. And then there's a distinction between the chisel shape is the ones that are kind of flat across it, and then the ones that are angled are the ones that are angled, as this one is. Although I think over the years I've kind of blunted that angle down a bit by use. So that's what those are if you read about that. Now, liner brushes, as I'd mentioned, tend to have much longer bristles, but they tend to have a very sharp point. They're going to be longer and thinner, because in a round, if I had this width of brushes, the length of the bristles would be much shorter, but because this is a liner brush, it's much longer. Now, where you can see the difference in sizing is these two are both synthetic brushes. They're Blick Masterclass brushes. The one on the left is a round, and the one on the right is a liner. And you can see that the round has a much fatter belly, but the brush length, the length of the brush is about the same. So a liner brush is going to give you more of a belly for holding paint, but still be very narrow and have a very fine point, and give you a much different painting profile. Now, there are also fan brushes, and that's the ones that look like that. They're just spread out a lot. I had one time, a very nice one that someone had given me, and I think they were being less nice about giving me the brush and just more about unloading some of their art supplies, and they didn't want to have the heart to throw them away. But I didn't find a whole lot of use for it in modeling. I don't even know what happened to it. I had it here somewhere years ago, and it's probably in one of the drawers around here. But they're very wide, and I've seen Bob Ross use them in oil painting. I just never found that they were very useful in modeling. I'm sure somebody would say, well, here's a use that I've done for them, and I'm sure there are uses. I just never found them very useful. There's also filbert brushes, which are kind of flat, but they're kind of round, and I used to have one, and I don't know what I did with it either. So I'm going to put this up on screen to show you what a filbert is. But that one, I feel like I need to get a filbert. If I can't find the one I had, I need to get one, because I feel like those would have a little more use to us in the modeling hobby. But virtually everything I do when it comes to brushes is going to be one of these three types: liner, flat, or round. The exception, of course, is when I use some kind of dry brush, whatever type that is. Now, a lot of folks just use these flats for dry brushing, and they're fine. If you like those, use them. I've switched to the dry brush kind of things. A note on these chisel brushes, where I find them good is if I'm doing dry brushing, it gives me the ability to easily get a large area and then just kind of flip it on its side and not have to worry about. It's a little easier to get into a fine detail just because of that angle rather than it being flat. It's a small point, but hey, it sounds impressive on camera, right? So anyway, this is just kind of a deep dive into the sizes of brushes and the types of brushes, and knowing a little bit about that will help you when you're making your, hopefully, when you're making your brush purchasing decisions.